moment the door swung open, everything stopped. The air in the room turned heavy, thick with something undeniable. Her body froze, her heart pounding so loudly she swore it echoed through the silence. Her husband stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes that once looked at her with love, with trust, now held nothing but devastation. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His cousin was still beside her, still too close. His hands had been on her only moments ago. The heat of his touch still lingered on her skin. The evidence of what had just happened was everywhere, in the way her hair was dishevelled, in the way she gasped as she scrambled away, as if distance could erase what had already been done. But it couldn't. There was no undoing this, no rewinding time, no excuse that could soften the blow. Her husband's breathing grew uneven, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the two people who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. She had never seen him look so broken. His fingers curled at his sides, his body stiff as if he was holding himself together by sheer force. His cousin shifted awkwardly, glancing toward her, but neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. Then, finally, her husband spoke, his voice raw, cracked. "Tell me I'm wrong." The desperation in his tone shattered something inside her. She wanted to lie, to reach for him, to make him believe this was some kind of mistake, that he hadn't seen what he thought he had. But no words came, because he was right. Her throat felt dry, her hands shaking. His expression darkened. "How long?" She swallowed, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. Her steps back felt like steps into an abyss, a place she would never escape from. She had spent months justifying this, telling herself that no one would ever know, that it wasn't hurting anyone. But now she saw the truth in the way he looked at her. She had destroyed him. His cousin exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his guilt written across his face. "Man, shut up!" The words weren't loud, but they carried more weight than a scream ever could. His cousin looked away, shame clouding his features. But shame wouldn't fix this. Her husband's eyes locked onto hers again, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. She opened her mouth, searching for words that didn't exist. But it didn't matter. He already knew. And in that moment she realized she hadn't just lost him. She had lost everything. The marriage had started like any other, full of love, passion, and the belief that they could weather anything together. They had built a life on trust, laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing they had each other. In the early years, there was excitement, surprise, a pull between them that never seemed to fade. But time has a way of dulling even the brightest flames. The passion had turned into routine. Conversations became shorter, focused on bills, schedules, and responsibilities. The small gestures, morning kisses, long hugs, deep conversations, became rarer. He was still a good husband, still kind, still dependable, but something was missing. Or maybe she was the one who was missing something. And then there was him. Her husband's cousin had always been around, part of family gatherings, barbecues, and holidays. He was familiar, safe in the way extended family often is, always nearby, but never too close. Until one day that changed. At first it was nothing. A shared joke at a family dinner, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, the way his compliments seemed a little more personal. "You look beautiful today," he had said once, and for a moment it wasn't just a casual remark. It felt different. She laughed it off, told herself she was imagining things. But then came the small moments, talks that stretched too long, the way he listened, really listened, when she spoke. He noticed the little things, her favourite wine, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way her voice changed when she talked about something she was passionate about. He paid attention in ways her husband hadn't in a long time. It made her feel seen, and she let herself believe it was harmless. But then, one night, they were alone. A family gathering had ended, and everyone else had left or gone to bed. The air was heavy with something unspoken. He sat beside her closer than usual, and when she turned to say something, his face was inches from hers. She should have moved away. She should have laughed, changed the subject, walked out of the room. But she didn't. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, let the weight of his gaze press against her skin. And when he reached for her, when his fingers brushed against her wrist, she didn't pull away. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, just a touch that lingered, a touch that changed everything. She lived 2 lives. By day, she was the perfect wife, the woman who cooked dinner, kissed her husband goodbye and asked how his day had been with a warm smile. The woman who made sure the laundry was done, the house was clean, and the world outside saw nothing but a stable, happy marriage. But when no one was watching, she was someone else. The rush of secrecy consumed her, the thrill of stolen moments, of whispered words exchanged in the shadows, of meeting his cousin's eyes across a crowded room and knowing exactly what they were both thinking. It started slowly, cautiously. A glance that lingered too long, a brush of fingers as she passed him in the hallway. A late-night text she told herself meant nothing, but it did mean something. It was dangerous, intoxicating, forbidden. And that was what made it impossible to stop. The first time they kissed, she told herself it would be the last. She swore to herself that she would end it before it got worse. But the more she pulled away, the more she was drawn back in. Secret meetings became routine. Quick moments stolen in quiet corners. Hushed phone calls when her husband was in the shower. Late-night excuses to step outside and get some air. Her heart pounded every time they were alone. Every look he gave her sent a shiver down her spine. Every time she heard his voice, her pulse quickened. The guilt crept in slowly, clawing its way into her thoughts when she lay beside her husband at night, pretending nothing had changed. She told herself she was in control, that she could stop whenever she wanted, but she never did. She deleted messages the second she read them. She memorized lies before she had to tell them. She made sure every detail was covered, every excuse perfectly planned. And yet there were moments she almost got caught. A family dinner where his cousin's knee brushed against hers beneath the table, the touch lingering just a little too long. The way her husband's gaze flickered between them, something unreadable passing over his face. A text notification lighting up her phone at the worst possible moment. Her husband's voice, casual but firm. "Who's that?" A hesitation, a forced laugh. "Just a friend." She thought she was careful. She thought she had covered her tracks. Until one evening, after a family gathering, a friend pulled her aside, a knowing look, a quiet warning. "Be careful," they said. "Secrets like this don't stay hidden forever." A chill ran down her spine. For the first time she felt something real. Fear. The air in the room shifted, thick with something suffocating. The kind of stillness that came when something irreversible had just happened. She had felt safe, hidden in the illusion that her secret was untouchable, that the lies she had told were woven tightly enough to keep her husband in the dark. But all of that shattered the moment she turned and saw him standing in the doorway. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. His cousin stepped back instantly, guilt spreading across his face, his body tensing as if preparing for the impact of what had just been exposed. But there was no impact, no immediate explosion of rage, just silence. And that was worse, because the silence held weight, more weight than any words ever could. Her husband's hands were at his sides, clenched into fists, his jaw tight, his breathing uneven. She knew this man. She knew his moods, his expressions, the way he reacted to things. But this was something she had never seen before. Betrayal. Not just any betrayal. A betrayal that had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She opened her mouth, scrambling for words, for an excuse, for anything to make this less damning than it already was. But what could she say? His eyes moved slowly between them. He wasn't looking for an explanation. He already knew. The reality of the moment settled in her chest like a weight pressing down on her ribs, making it hard to breathe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Tell me I'm imagining this." His voice was quieter than she expected. Not angry, just hollow. The lump in her throat grew larger. His cousin shifted awkwardly, running a hand over his face, but still, he said nothing. He knew there was no way to fix this. The silence dragged on, heavier than before. Her husband exhaled sharply, his head tilting slightly as if he was trying to process the image in front of him, trying to convince himself that this was a nightmare he would wake up from. But he wasn't waking up. His voice came again, slower this time. "How long?" She flinched at the question. Her mind scrambled for an answer, but every possible response only led to the same outcome. He already knew the truth, and no lie could undo what he had just seen. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating. She had destroyed something sacred. She had broken something that could never be put back together. The house no longer felt like a home. It was the same place, the same walls, the same furniture. But everything inside it had changed. The warmth was gone, the laughter, the small moments of comfort, the quiet ease between them. All of it had been replaced with silence. Her husband barely looked at her now. When he did, it was different. There was no love in his eyes, no familiarity, just something distant, something broken. She tried to speak to him, to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. "It didn't mean anything," she whispered one night. He turned to her, his face unreadable. Then finally he spoke. "Then why did you destroy everything for it?" She had no answer. There was no answer. Because it did mean something. If it hadn't, it wouldn't have happened. Her steps were careful around him now, her words measured. She didn't know how to exist in the same space as him anymore. He didn't yell, didn't scream, didn't throw accusations in her face. He just didn't care. And somehow that was worse. She would have preferred a fight, a chance to defend herself, to plead, to argue. But he gave her nothing, just cold, unbearable silence. She reached for him once, desperate, needing him to react, needing him to say something that told her there was still a chance. He flinched, pulled away like her touch burned him. It felt like a knife straight to the heart. The cousin was gone too, no calls, no texts, nothing. She wasn't sure if he had left out of guilt or shame, but it didn't matter. He had disappeared, leaving her alone with the wreckage. Her husband's voice rang in her head over and over again. "You didn't just cheat. You did this with someone who shares my blood." It was different from a normal betrayal. It wasn't just about her or about their marriage. It was about family. She hadn't just destroyed their relationship. She had destroyed something deeper, something sacred. And there was no fixing that. Every night she lay awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, wishing she could undo it all, wishing she could go back to before the lies, before the stolen moments, before everything crumbled around her. But she couldn't. Some mistakes can be forgiven, some can't. And the terrifying part was, she knew this was the kind that couldn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clenched together, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. He hadn't spoken to her in hours, not since he had looked her in the eye and told her the words she had been dreading. "I want you out." She had begged. Tears had fallen freely, her voice shaking as she pleaded with him to reconsider. "We can fix this. I'll do anything. I made a mistake, but I love you." He just stood there, unmoving, his face unreadable. The man she had once known, the man who had once held her like she was his world, was gone. "You don't love me," he said, his voice hollow. Her chest tightened. "Yes, I do." "No," he said again, this time stronger. "You loved the attention, the risk, the thrill, but you didn't love me. If you had, this never would have happened." She shook her head, but she couldn't argue. He wasn't wrong. He exhaled sharply, as if the weight of everything was finally crushing him. His eyes burned with something she couldn't name. Anger, grief, exhaustion. "It's over," he said. "I can't be with someone I don't trust. I won't." Her vision blurred. She had known this was coming. She had felt it the second he found out. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. Still, she begged. "Please, let's talk about this. Let's go to therapy. We can fix us." He let out a bitter laugh. "Us?" He shook his head, looking at her like she was a stranger. "There is no us anymore." His words cut deeper than anything. Her hands trembled as she reached for him again, one last attempt to find something, anything, that would make him stay. He stepped back. Her heart sank. That was it. The final moment. She had lost him. Her husband, her best friend, the person she had built a life with. He was walking away, and it was all her fault. The next few days were a blur. The house they had shared for years was no longer hers. She packed her things, stuffing clothes into bags, her hands shaking as she moved from room to room. Every object, every picture, every little detail of their life together mocked her. By the time she was done, the reality of it hit her like a crushing weight. She wasn't just losing him, she was losing everything, their home, their life, their future, and worst of all, the person she used to be. As she closed the door behind her for the last time, the truth settled deep in her chest. Some betrayals can be forgiven. This wasn't one of them. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months. Yet the weight of her actions never left her. It clung to her, followed her in every quiet moment, every empty room, every second she spent alone. She thought time would make it easier, that the guilt would fade, that the ache in her chest would become bearable. But time didn't heal everything. Some wounds never closed. Her new life felt unfamiliar, like she was watching someone else move through the motions. She woke up to silence, no longer greeted by the warmth of her husband's presence beside her. There were no shared meals, no small, thoughtless moments that once made up their days. The bed felt too big, the apartment too small. Loneliness became her new reality. She saw glimpses of him sometimes, through social media, through mutual friends, through accidental encounters that left her breathless. He looked different now, lighter, happier, like a man who had freed himself from something that once held him back, and he wasn't alone. Her stomach twisted the first time she saw him with someone new, a woman with a kind smile, standing beside him at an event. The way he looked at her was different. That was when she knew. He had let go. While she was still drowning in regret, still wishing she could undo everything, he had moved on. And the cousin? Gone. No calls, no texts, nothing. As if he had never existed in her life at all. For a long time she thought about reaching out, about explaining herself, about saying the words she had never said out loud. I made a mistake. I never meant to hurt you. I destroyed something real for something that never meant anything. But none of it mattered now. He didn't need her apologies. He didn't need anything from her. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she needed more, that she wasn't satisfied, that something was missing in her life. But in the end, she had been the one to lose everything. Some betrayals don't get forgiven. Some choices come with permanent consequences. She thought she was chasing something exciting, but she had only been running toward her own destruction. She closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath as the truth settled deep inside her. Some losses are forever, and this one was hers.